Você consegue me ver aqui, Rafa? Eu abrindo uma outra tela?
Estou te vendo, mas eu não vejo outra tela.
Não, tudo bem. Eu não estou abrindo a outra tela, não.
Tá.
Who is gonna have a presentation here? Only Rion van der Merwe, or is there any other person that will have a presentation, a PowerPoint?
Estou te vendo.
I don't have, Zaca.
Okay.
Senhores, agora estamos oficialmente no YouTube, tá? No canal do YouTube. Vou passar o endereço.
Já está gravando, Rafa?
Do PowerPoint. Você está tentando colocar o PowerPoint na tela, é isso?
Não, o senhor Rion van der Merwe que vai ter o PowerPoint. Só ele, durante a apresentação dele. E vai ser a terceira apresentação.
Tá, eu habilitei aqui a apresentação de tela para todos os participantes. Se alguém desejar em algum momento colocar, será possível. Se tiver dificuldade, pode procurar a gente aqui. A gente dá um auxílio, tá? Eu vou passar para os senhores o endereço da nossa live do YouTube. Vou colocar primeiro no grupo. E eu vou colocar no nosso chat aqui. Ok? Se os senhores já conseguirem ver. Eu vou tirar minha imagem da tela. E agora, 9h05, Ricardo, se você se sentir à vontade, pode dar início aos trabalhos, tá?
Podemos começar, Rafa. Muito obrigado.
Boa sorte aos senhores, tá? Valeu, gente. Obrigado.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening for those who are not in Brazil. We are really excited to open the fifth BRICS, the BRICS Summit, the fifth BRICS Conference of Universidade de São Paulo, the São Paulo University. Today, we're going to discuss in the first panel about the South-South relations. The BRICS, the fifth BRICS conference of USP will have the theme of cooperation and consensus in the rearrangement of global relations. So here we have with us today the Minister of the People's Republic of China in Brasilia, Brazil, Minister Jin Hongjin. We do also have the Secretary of Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Mauricio Heleno, also Mr. Rion van der Merwe from the BRICS Youth Studies in South Africa, and we do also have Professor Dr. Evandro Carvalho, which is responsible, which works at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas Foundation, the Faculty of Law, and which is a senior Brazilian specialist. Now, I think that everybody can breathe knowledge. This is what I'm feeling. I'm really, really excited to have you all here. We're gonna begin the presentation, the 20 minutes presentation each, beginning with Honorable Minister Jin Hongjin from People's Republic of China. Please allow me to explain, to tell about his mini bio. He is the Minister of the Embassy of China in Brazil since December of 2020. Formerly, Minister Jin Hongjin served as ambassador to the Republic of Guinea-Bissau from 2017 to 2020. Before that, he served in various posts in Chinese embassy in Cape Verde, Portugal, and office of the Commissioner of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China in Macau, Special Administrative Region. Minister Jin Hongjin, the floor is all yours, and on behalf of the BRICS research of USP, I'm really honored to have you here. You're going to have 20 minutes for this excellent presentation of South-South relations. Welcome and join us.
Thank you. Mr. José Ricardo dos Santos Luiz Jr., Secretary Mauricio Heleno, Mr. Rian van der Merwe, Professor Evandro Carvalho. Good mornings and good afternoon to Mr. Merwe. It is a great pleasure to attend the 5th BRICS conference organized by the Center for BRICS Studies of the University of São Paulo. As an authoritative BRICS research institute in Brazil, the center has been committed to promoting mutual learning and cooperation among BRICS countries, and has become a helpful platform for all to exchange ideas and build consensus. On behalf of His Excellency Ambassador Yang Wanmin, I would like to pay tribute to your efforts. The theme of today's conference is cooperation and consensus in the rearrangement of global relations. It accords with the development trend of the era and is of significant contemporary relevance. Today's world is going through major changes unseen in a century. The international landscape of politics, economy, technology, and security are undergoing profound adjustments, which have been accelerated by COVID-19. We've witnessed global challenges such as uneven economic recovery, widening North-South development gap, and resurfacing unilateralism and Cold War mentality, as well as untraditional security threats in such areas as public health, environment, and climate change. All of us are asking where the world is going and what should we do as mankind. All parties have gradually realized that under such major changes, upholding peace and development is a coordinated manner. In a coordinated manner is still the most urgent task, and cooperation and consensus are more important than ever. I want to share 3 opinions of mine. First, the trend of peaceful development and win-win cooperation remains unchanged. A lesson from the pandemic is that mankind are closely connected, and we all live in the same global village with a shared future. Only by cooperating in solidarity could we win this defensive battle for people's lives and health, and promote early recovery and restart of the world economy. Seeking one's own interest at the expense of others and creating division and confrontation will only undermine the international community's efforts to unite and cooperate, and exacerbate inequality in global development. COVID-19 will not be our last crisis. Only by building a community of shared future for mankind and a global village where all countries live in harmony could we better respond to future global challenges. Second, the momentum of emerging countries' collective rise remains unchanged. Since the 21st century, developing countries and emerging markets represented by BRICS have been moving closer to the center stage of world order. We have become important factors in global landscape transformation and major drivers of the development towards a more balanced multipolarity. COVID-19 and protectionism have slowed emerging economies' development momentum to some extent. However, in the long run, from 1980 to 2020, the share of emerging market countries and developing countries in world economy has increased from 24.3% to 40.6%, contributing 80% of world economic growth. Meanwhile, that of G7 has fallen from 62% to 45%. In the next decade, the share of emerging market countries is expected to total half of the world economy and exceed that of developed countries for the first time in history. As long as we remain united and work together, we are fully capable of boosting the world economy again and becoming an anchor amid turbulences. Third, the call for defending true multilateralism remains unchanged. Multilateralism is the cornerstone of democratic international relations. On many occasions, President Xi Jinping has vowed to support equality among all countries, big or small, strong or weak, rich or poor. International issues should be decided through extensive consultation. The governance system should be built through joint contribution, and development benefits should be shared by all parties. Only by defending the UN-centered international system and the international order based on international law, by resolutely opposing hegemony and power politics, where might is right, a winner takes all, and by replacing conflict with dialogue, coercion with consultation, and zero-sum with win-win, could we safeguard peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, and freedom, which are the common values of humanity, and advanced a more equitable international order. Ladies and gentlemen, under the influence of unprecedented global changes and once-in-a-century pandemic, developing countries are facing more severe challenges in fighting the epidemic, promoting economic growth, and protecting people's livelihood. Further strengthening South-South cooperation is beneficial, not only for developing countries to seek strength through unity, but also for promoting global recovery. As the largest developing country, China has always been a supporter, participant, and a contributor to South-South cooperation. Both the Belt and Road Initiative proposed by President Xi Jinping 8 years ago and the Global Development Initiative proposed recently at the UN General Assembly uphold the spirit of partnership featuring openness and inclusiveness. Both aim to provide the international community, including developing countries, with public goods to resolve difficulties and create opportunities in development. Representing about 30% of the territory, 42% of population, and 1/5 of the world economy, BRICS countries are the most influential emerging powers and a force to be reckoned with the international arena. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the inception of the BRICS concept and the 15th anniversary of the BRICS cooperation mechanism. For long, member countries have been committed to openness, inclusiveness, and win-win cooperation. We have stepped up cooperation in such areas as economy, trade, finance, political security, and people-to-people exchanges. We've established important mechanisms such as New Development Bank, Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the BRICS Partnership on New Industrial Revolution, and BRICS Plus. These have become important platforms for cooperation among emerging markets and developing countries, and has given a strong impetus to South-South cooperation and world development. During the pandemic, BRICS countries have maintained the momentum of cooperation and sent out a collective voice of BRICS countries to strengthen public health and vaccine cooperation, promote global economic recovery, implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and defend equity and justice. Brazil, the largest developing country in the Western Hemisphere and a major power of Latin America, is a promoter and beneficiary of BRICS cooperation. South Africa, the only African members of BRICS, is actively bridging BRICS and African countries. Next year, China will take over the BRICS chairmanship and host a series of events, including the 14th BRICS Summit. China is looking forward to working with fellow members to steer BRICS cooperation along the direction of high-quality development through the following efforts. First, China is willing to further strengthen vaccine cooperation with BRICS countries and make active contribution to promoting the equitable distribution of vaccine and global cooperation against COVID-19. To date, China has provided more than 1.2 billion doses of finished and bulk vaccine to over 100 countries and international organizations. By the end of this year, China will strive to provide a total of 2 billion doses and will donate an additional 100 million doses of vaccine to fellow developing countries, on top of the $100 million donation to COVAX. Meanwhile, China will facilitate an early launch of BRICS Vaccine R&D Center in virtual format to develop more tools against the virus. Second, China is willing to deepen economic cooperation with other members and implement the strategy for BRICS Economic Partnership 2025 by expanding cooperation in such areas as trade and investment, technology and innovation, and green and low carbon development. China has proposed to host a BRICS high-level meeting on climate change and the BRICS Forum on Big Data for Sustainable Development. The BRICS Partnership on New Industrial Revolution Innovation Center has already launched in Xiamen. Next year, the center plans to hold a forum on the development of industrial internet and digital manufacturing, among other activities. We look forward to active participation of government departments and business communities of BRICS countries. Third, China is willing to defend true multilateralism with BRICS countries, coordinate positions on major international and regional issues, defend fairness and justice, and make the world economy more open, inclusive, balanced, and beneficial to all. Fourth and finally, China is willing to enhance people-to-people exchanges with BRIC countries. Against the backdrops of the pandemic, we will explore new forms of cooperation, make good use of the digital tools and platforms, continuously enrich cooperation among member countries in people-to-people exchanges, and lay a solid foundation of popular support for BRICS cooperation. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, China and Brazil are comprehensive strategic partners. Since establishing diplomatic relations 47 years ago, the two countries have been steadily developing our relationship, exploring new areas of cooperation, and keeping good coordination in multilateral institutions such as BRICS, G20, and the United Nations. After the outbreak of the pandemic, China was the first country to start vaccine cooperation with Brazil, and our partnership has been essential in Brazil's management of the coronavirus crisis. Looking into the post-pandemic world, China, Brazil, and other BRICS countries will continue to have broad common interests and bright prospects of cooperation. China is looking forward to working with member countries to add fresh vitality to BRICS cooperation, broaden South-South cooperation, promote a more equitable international order, and deliver benefits to peoples of BRICS countries and around the world. I wish this conference a complete success. Thank you.
Dear Minister Jin Hongjin, thank you very much for your presentation. Definitely, I also do agree that we need to continue our efforts to build a win-win cooperation and having a peaceful cooperation with the BRICS countries as we live in a global village fighting for a common shared future. We are very honored to have the Embassy of People's Republic of China today here in our event. So on behalf of Professor Paulo Borba Casella, the coordinator of the Center for BRICS Studies, I really thank you for your presentation here. It was really insightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So we shall continue our presentations here. For those who just joined us, we are on the first panel of the 5th BRICS conference of USP with the theme of cooperation and consensus in the rearrangement of global relations. And this panel is about the South-South relations team. So we have now joining us the Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Secretary Mauricio Heleno. He has also a Master at Public Policies and Society, as well as he's a law graduate. Secretary Mauricio Heleno, we are very honored to have you also here, and we are excited to hear your 20 minutes presentation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Mr. José Ricardo Luiz Jr., distinguished panelists, distinguished audience, good morning from Brasilia. In the first place, I would like to congratulate USP BRICS for organizing this important event with academics, thinkers, and authorities from the 5 BRICS countries. I wish you all a good conference. My presentation will be based on 4 points. I'll give you a brief context, then I will talk about the principles of South-South cooperation, then I will talk about BRICS cooperation and the pro tempore presidency of India in 2021, and then I will present a brief conclusion. The first point is about the current context. I would like to start my intervention by briefly analyzing the international situation, especially from the point of view of the Brazilian interests. The world faces one of the most challenging junctures of the last few centuries. Issues such as a global pandemic, economic crisis, political polarization, and rising international rivalries are putting heavy pressure on countries and international organizations. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the existence of global problems that demand international consultation and national capabilities. The world needs today organized nation states cooperating towards common goals and credible international organizations capable of coordinating joint efforts. The post-COVID-19 world will be highly uncertain. It could lead us to new and reformed international arrangements that bring prosperity, or to a renewed period of conflict and military tensions. The future depends on civil societies and political leaderships to follow a peaceful and prosperous path. Today, the main multilateral pillars are in disarray. Peace and security, represented by the United Nations Security Council, nuclear disarmament, environment, poverty, hunger, human rights, health, and global inequalities tend to deteriorate in the years to come if nations and international organizations do not find a minimal level of consensus in these fields. In my opinion, the main Brazil's concerns today are these, which follows. The country's priority is promoting sustainable development, eradicating poverty and hunger, and deepening the international presence of the country. For these goals to be achieved, we need a peaceful and stable international environment in which the country can participate in the main multilateral organizations and preserve its decision-making autonomy. Brazil is also aware that these objectives cannot be reached alone. Free partnerships with emerging and developed countries are vital to fulfill common goals. Therefore, a polarized world order is not of our interests. What I mean here is that Brazil needs a peaceful and stable world order. We do not want a new Cold War in which Brazil is forced to take sides. That is the worst case scenario for us. We want and we need to navigate freely towards every country in the world, establishing free partnerships and exchanging knowledge, exchanging interests in favor of common goals. Returning to the old normal is not a possibility. The world needs a new international framework that enables sustainable development and political participation to all emerging countries. Now I'm going to the second point, South-South cooperation and BRICS cooperation. I would like to present my view on these topics. For me, South-South cooperation is a model of cooperation based on the following principles. First, it's human-centered. Its focus is on the improvement of life of populations, not the interest of bureaucracies or organizations. The idea here is South-South cooperation must change people's lives for the better. It's not propaganda, it's not for advertisement of governments or international organizations. It must be meaningful, it must change people's lives. Second, it's based on a long-term view. It is focused on changing deeply rooted problems, which demands constant and targeted actions. If the idea is change people's lives for the better, South-South cooperation must have a long-term view, long-term projects, not short-sighted initiatives with the aim of winning elections or make propaganda. It must be serious and focused on real problems. Third, it's horizontal and free of political conditionalities. It's based on consensus. So one country does not demand the approval of institutional arrangements or laws, specific laws, in order to provide cooperation. South-South cooperation is based, therefore, on horizontality, in which a country cannot impose conditions on other countries in order to provide help, in order to exchange knowledge and provide cooperation. Fourth, it's a win-win-win model of cooperation. Yes, I mentioned win 3 times, and I will explain why. It is based on mutual gains for all the parties involved. So it's a win-win cooperation because both parties win in this model of cooperation based on the exchange of knowledge. But the third win here is, it's because this model of cooperation in some cases generates positive spillovers that benefits other countries and the entire international community. In the case of BRICS, for example, when we demand the reform of international organizations, or when we declare that immunization is a global public good, we are striving for a global benefit for the entire international community. We are not benefiting only the BRICS members, but we are generating positive spillovers that can affect the entire international community. The New Development Bank is also a good example. When the bank expanded its membership towards new members, we are generating positive spillovers to other countries aside from BRICS. Fifth, respect for sovereignty. South-South cooperation respects the plurality of institutions, cultures, laws, and forms of governments, united by common principles of respect for the international law. And BRICS is a very good example of that, because it's based on 5 countries with very different institutions and political cultures and models of representation, which do not hinder cooperation. Actually, we benefit from this plurality. It's a form of exchanging knowledge and learning from each other. So respecting each other's sovereignty is our main strength here. With these principles in mind, we believe that South-South cooperation can set the model for future cooperation frameworks by aiming at creating public goods for the entire international community. The future will face new epidemics, environmental, economic, and social crises. So all the voices should be heard equally, especially those from the developing world. As Minister said, we will face new pandemics. We will face new challenges, and we have to decide what to do. We will militarize international relations. We focus on tensions and divergences, or we will build new institutions, new arrangements that provide cooperation, peace, and stability for the international community. It's our choice, and we have to take it today. Next point, I will talk about BRICS and the deliverables of the current presidency. Why BRICS in the first place? For Brazil, inter-BRICS cooperation brings meaningful results for its population in a vast array of areas, such as economy, finance, security, science, technology, and others. Moreover, It is a group of emerging countries that aims at reforming international institutions so that they become more representative, inclusive, and legitimate. BRICS is an opportunity for Brazil to display its universalist vocation, dialogue with important countries directly, and enhance its participation in relevant international spaces as a credible, peaceful, and responsible stakeholder. In the case of BRICS, it is a grouping based on three pillars: political and security, economic and financial, and cultural or people-to-people exchanges. The priorities of the pro-tempore presidency, which Brazil fully supported, are reform of the multilateral system, counter-terrorism cooperation, digital and technological solutions for sustainable development goals achievement, and enhance interpersonal exchanges. Now I will talk briefly about some of the main deliverables for this year, which brought us very good results. First and foremost, the BRICS joint statement on strengthening and reforming the multilateral system. It was a joint declaration, a leader's declaration, in which the 5 countries declared the interest in reforming the main international institutions, main international multilateral organizations such as United Nations, the United Nations Security Council, the IMF, the World Health Organization, and others. I invite you all to read this declaration because it demonstrates the level of consensus at BRICS. Unfortunately, we couldn't reach an agreement on including Brazil, India, and South Africa in an expanded Security Council, but it was a very meaningful document for Brazil. Counterterrorism Action Plan. It's a document which provides specific measures to implement the BRICS counterterrorism strategy, with provisions in the field of prevention of terrorism, capacity building, which is a priority for Brazil, and joint actions against terrorism and radicalization. Next, an agreement on the cooperation on BRICS remote sensing satellite constellation. It was an agreement that was being negotiated for many years. And this year we could reach an agreement in this document, which marks cooperation in the field of sharing data and satellite image. It has usages in various areas such as environment and prevention of deforestation. Agriculture Action Plan. It establishes common principles and measures for combating hunger, improving productivity, and fulfilling the SDGs in the 5 countries. Agricultural Research Cooperation Platform. It's a platform of scientific knowledge in agriculture shared among the 5 countries with the goal to improve cooperation in research, technology, and innovation in the field of agriculture. Digital Goods Platform. It's in discussion, but it establishes the creation of a repository for all open source technology applications developed by BRICS members towards achieving SDGs for the benefit of BRICS and other developing countries. That's an example of what I mentioned as a win-win-win cooperation, because if approved, it will be open to every country. Open source technology aiming at fulfilling the sustainable development goals. I hope it's approved briefly. Then the expansion of the new development bank. with the inclusion of Bangladesh, United Arab Emirates, and Uruguay. It reinforces the bank's role in favor of sustainable development in the member countries and in favor of the new members. I would like to remind you that the principles of the New Development Bank are sustainable development, the improvement of infrastructure in the 5 members, now 8 members, and no imposition of conditionalities. The approval of projects is negotiated with each country without imposing conditions of regarding the approval of laws or specific institutions in order to receive the lending of money. For example, in 2020, Brazil received $1 billion from the NDB in support of our emergency program in favor of the population in the context of COVID-19. It was a very important help from the New Development Bank to the country, to the 5 countries in coping the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. I would also like to stress the activities of the BRICS Business Council and the BRICS Women's Business Alliance as the 3rd pillar, people-to-people inter-cooperation. Both initiatives promote the integration of the business communities of the 5 countries. And the second one, the Women's Business Alliance, provides a specific approach in favor of women-led companies. Actions such as capacity building and financial education, digital education are promoted by the Alliance in favor of women entrepreneurs. And finally, to conclude, I'd like to stress that South-South cooperation represents an important principle of the Brazilian diplomatic activity, since we are still a country that faces long-standing economic and social challenges, but which has accumulated expertise and good examples to share. As a regional power, Brazil can play a larger role in international affairs. It does so already by promoting its values and positive actions. We are a country capable of establishing dialogue in all international spheres, with a view to cooperate and present consensual solutions to common issues. That is the pillar of our participation, not only in BRICS, but also in the IBSA mechanism, another good example of cooperation format based on South-South cooperation values. And I would like to open a brief parenthesis if I have time. Ricardo, do I have time? Yes, thank you. We can't talk about South-South cooperation without mentioning IBSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa mechanism. I know it's an event about BRICS, but I think IBSA and BRICS are like brothers. They are very important initiatives for Brazil. IBSA is a good example of soft power projection for Brazil because it's based on the cooperation among 3 multi-ethnic, multi-racial, plural democracies of the global South. With a very promising results for our country. I would like to mention, for example, the IBSA fund, which is a very modest fund, but with very meaningful results in countries like the Palestine, Mali, Haiti, and many others in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. I'd like to invite you all to study and research IBSA as well, not only BRICS, and their complementarities, their differences, and they're good examples for the entire international community. And to finalize, I invite you all to seek more details about the BRICS deliverables in 2021. I gave you just a brief presentation with a very brief summary of the results. There is much more. Our societies and academic communities should know and spread the positive outcomes of our cooperation. Next year, we will have the Chinese pro-tempore presidency, and we have very good expectations on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation, your excellent view on the BRICS relations, and also your thoughts about the importance, as you said, that the world needs a new international framework and fight for sustainable development and for human-centered policies. It's on behalf of Professor Paulo Borba Casella, the coordinator of the Center for BRICS Study, and I would like to again stress our gratitude for the presence of the Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs on your behalf, Secretary Mauricio Leno. And we today, during the South-South Relations panel in this 5th BRICS conference of USP, with the theme of cooperation and consensus in the rearrangement of global relations, we had the insights from China, from Chinese authority, from the Embassy of People's Republic of China in Brasilia, Brazil. We also had the insights from the Secretary, from the Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Mauricio Leno. And now we would like to hear the thoughts from South Africa. So we are live on YouTube. We are very honored and delighted to have Mr. Rian van der Merwe. Hope that I pronounced your name correctly. We are honored to have you here in our BRICS, the Center for BRICS Studies platform. I would like to read quickly the mini bio from Mr. Rian van der Merwe. He is a graduate and youth activist from South Africa with a research interest in regionalism, South-South cooperation, and youth diplomacy. He serves as Director for Stakeholder Relations at the South African BRICS Youth Association, the SABYA, a South African NPO dedicated to the promotion of a youth-focused agenda within the BRICS bloc. Rian holds a degree in politics, philosophy, and economy, as well as in development studies, both from the University of Cape Town. He is currently completing his master's research in international relations at the same institution. Rian also serves on the National Board of UN Association of South Africa under the portfolio of youth development. So we are here live on YouTube. Thank you for Instituto Ibrachina for this transmission. And Rian, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much for your time. Good afternoon in South Africa.
Thank you, Ricardo. Before I start my presentation, I would just also like to thank Minister Jin and also Secretary Leno for their thorough presentations of both setting the agenda for 2022's BRICS in China and also a thorough review of all the projects that have happened in 2021. As Ricardo mentioned, I'm representing the South African BRICS Youth Association here today. So more in the capacity of a youth activist than an academic. I think Professor Carvalho is going to cover us on that front. So I hope that my presentation is enlightening in that regard. So I'm just quickly going to share my screen. Is that visible, Ricardo? All right, great.
Yeah, it is. You can just
write it.
Yeah,
so,
perfectly.
Thank you so much. So the topic that we as the South African BRICS Youth Association wanted to bring to this forum is specifically prioritizing the BRICS youth agenda as a cornerstone for South-South cooperation. As a youth-focused development organization, this is obviously very important for us, not only in South Africa, but across the board. Many of my other colleagues have also been invited to participate in panels for the conference for the next few days, and we're very grateful to GBRICS for inviting us and for partnering with us for this initiative. So prioritizing the BRICS youth agenda as a cornerstone for South-South cooperation. So the thesis of this presentation, just to give some context, is that to be young in the global South is a social phenomena that offers potential for new forms of South-South leadership in multilateralism. And in my presentation, I hope to break this down a bit more thoroughly. The first half of my presentation will focus on contextualizing youth as a sociological phenomenon within the global South. And then the second half will focus on practical ways that young people have engaged in international relations and multilateralism in the last few years, and what we can learn from those activities. So the first point that I would like to highlight is that when we count the youth, when we look at how many young people there are around the world, the United Nations tells us that there are currently 1.2 billion young people aged between the age of 15 and 24, accounting for 16% of the global population. But of course, many BRICS nations define youth as between the ages of 15 and 29. So that even that makes the bracket even wider, meaning that the population is closer to 1.8 billion. South Africa, of course, defines youth as from 15 to 35, following the African Union's definition. But for the sake of this presentation, I've used this as my parameter. So within BRICS, we have a population of over 700 million young people. So this is a significant demographic, and that contextualizes the importance of this specific presentation, the topic that we're going to address, in whether multilateralism and South-South cooperation is adequately including all of these young people in its various projects and activities. The three maps that I've highlighted here just in my preparation for this highlight firstly the globe as it was in 1980, the globe as it was in 2015, and the globe as it was in 2050. So looking at the 1980 globe, we can see that the majority of the countries in the world had a large portion of their population, up to a third of the population, being between the ages of 10 and 24. So a significantly younger world than we have today. In 2015, the same data from the World Economic Forum shows that the Western countries, or so-called developed countries, increased in age. And so their population grew increasingly older, their birth rates declined. And so overall, youth consisted a much smaller portion of their population. The estimate is that by 2050, the majority of countries which will have a large portion of their population being youth will be primarily within the global South. As you can see in the top right-hand corner, by 2050, it's estimated that Africa will still be one of the most youthful continents in the world. The youngest country with the youngest population being Niger, where the average population or the average age is 15 years old, which is significant, which is very young. And of course, India and also large portions of South America and Asia will remain youthful. So youth will continue to be a very important demographic, even though it will continue to be a shrinking demographic. As we can see, as countries develop, we know that birth rates decline, and so the population grows older. But the global South will continue to be young for the next few decades. Briefly highlighting just a phenomenon looking in the last few centuries, going back as far as the 1800s, the 1700s, we can see that the life expectancy remained around 30 to 40 years of age for the majority of the population. But then, of course, during the time of industrialization, we see a significant uptake in the life expectancy of the average individual, first in places like Europe and the Americas, and then later in places like Eastern Europe, Asia, and then, of course, Africa. So the phenomenon that this has created, and for the first time in human history, is that our societies are much more intergenerational than they have ever been before. So governments and political leaders need to think very critically about how they distribute resources, who's represented, whose interests are represented in policies when trying to balance the needs of older populations versus youth, which, as we saw in the previous slide, in the global South still remains a significant portion of the population. Another phenomena that I'd like to highlight in terms of youth when we think about youth in the global South is, of course, the differences in values and priorities of different generations. So I'm not going to go through all of this data here. It's provided by McKinsey and Company with research that they did with regards to the values of different generations. But the most important ones I would like to highlight is Generation Y and Generation Z on the most right-hand side. So Generation Y is obviously all of those who were born between 1980 and 1994, whereas Generation Z is everyone from 1995 to 2010. So Generation Z would be those who are currently in their late 20s, all the way up to their early adolescence, about 14, 15 years old. So that's exactly the time that we've defined youth as in this presentation. So the unique thing and the unique difference between Generation Y and Z is that even though Generation Y grew up in a time of increased globalization, we had the end of the Cold War, we had the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had the rise of emerging economies that changed the makeup of the international industry and production. Generation Z is much more inclined to consume ideas. They consume cultures through social media, through the internet. They have a much more global character and nature, rather than just producing products that are made abroad in vast supply chains. They now also consume ideas that are produced in various countries, ideologies, political philosophies. And so they're a much more nuanced generation in that regard. In the same way, you'll see at I think it's the second row here at behavior, the last characteristic that was mentioned here is realistic. And it's very interesting that the Generation Z, as opposed to generations before it, is much more in tune with the realities of the world. They have much more access to news. They understand social issues much more thoroughly. They have access to multiple views that they can choose from. And so the question that this data actually raises is, does BRICS in its totality and its approach to youth actually understand Generation Z within its own various countries, how Generation Z looks in South Africa, looks in China, looks in Brazil, looks in India, looks in Russia? And how do they understand how these young people are engaging with political spaces, with the international community, and all those arenas? So an important observation that the sociologist Mosca Phillips makes is that the young generation in particular faces a heritage that is essentially transnational, as is BRICS. Whether it regards technological progress or environmental degradation. Young people come into contact anew, not only with their own region's history, but with the entangled histories of those origins scattered across the globe. To different degrees and through different means, they harness and hybridize a diversity of cultural inventories to navigate a world that simultaneously becomes more interconnected and less capable of silencing long-standing inequities. So again, there's that thing of growing connectedness and also a growing sense of social awareness and need within society. And so now that we've looked at what youth is, what the modern youth are, what the characteristics are, and what the sort of position is that they fill in the world, the next part of this presentation that I would like to highlight briefly is how youth have attempted to use BRICS and to engage BRICS in a way that can push a youth agenda that allows them to put their priorities on the table and to engage those in decision-making positions. It also does this within a three-part framework. So a comprehensive approach to enhancing South-South relations through BRICS youth mobilization from the Sabia perspective would include education, engagement, and representation. So the presentation is briefly going to touch on all three of these because, of course, 20 minutes is never enough. So briefly touching on the issue of education. In preparing for this, I went back to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we all know that Sustainable Development Goal 4 touches on education, but most of the time it touches on the technical parts of education, how many youth are enrolled in schools, what's the quality of education, gender parity. But what we often forget is that the target 4.7 of SDG 4 relates to, and I'll quickly read it, that by 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. And within this regard, we believe that education of this particular nature is very relevant to BRICS for other reasons. It's highlighted in the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Group report that more than any other target, target 4.7 touches on the social, humanistic, and moral purposes of education. It explicitly links education to other SDGs and captures the transformative aspirations of the new global development agenda. And where else would BRICS be positioned than in the new development agenda? So to touch on some of the practical things that have been happening within BRICS that have tried to aspire this kind of transformative education approach as a humanistic and social transformative force. One of them that I would like to highlight is, of course, the issue of BRICS schools. So at the moment, there are two prominent BRICS schools operating. So the one is in Fudan University in Shanghai. The other one is organized annually by the National Committee on BRICS Research in Moscow. The education component has various useful elements for BRICS. First of all, it educates a new generation in thinking critically about BRICS through engaging with experts and peers. It creates opportunities for people-to-people relations and strengthens cultural understanding and cooperation. It forms a coherent BRICS identity. Sabia itself, many of our members and many of our executive leaders who are youth actually benefit from these kind of education opportunities. And then, of course, the last one is to reinforce and form a collective multilateral values of the BRICS among youth, which Secretary Heleno outlined before, the principles of multilateralism under BRICS. So this helps to ingrain this as among youth. The question that I would in this regard like to leave the audience is, what do youth need to be equipped with to become global citizens with a Southern perspective? Moving then on to the second element is engagement. So obviously youth engagement in the international arena has been ongoing for many years. What I highlight here is that many of us would be familiar with the idea of Model United Nations, which is an activity that many youth engage in often. The first Model League of Nations was actually hosted in 1923 at Harvard University. And since then, there are currently about 1,500 Model UN simulations happening continuously. The UN is, of course, only one multilateral institution that can benefit from this kind of education approach and engaging with youth in this way. Since then, obviously, as I mentioned, youth have grown increasingly active in the international arena as non-state actors have grown more active. And they've also had a more real-world view of issues with the advent of the internet, leading to what can be called an international youth ecosystem of various activities that are continuously ongoing. This includes, as I highlight in point 3, model diplomacy, youth dialogues, advocacy campaigns, and research about youth. And so in this way, engagement should be both educative and solution-orientated when engaging with youth. What we should, however, avoid, which I highlight at the bottom, is what Jessica Taft, the Associate Professor of Latin American Studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz, highlights as wowing. So wowing is when, and I'll quickly read what she says, wowing refers to those responses to youth activism that effusively celebrate the fact that youth are acting, but without meaningfully engaging with the content of young people's political ideas and actions. Wowing is overly eager enthusiasm and is experienced by many young people as patronizing, similar to when an adult tells a child that their artwork is simply the best thing they've ever seen. And so as young people, we're not looking to be wowed within the BRICS community. What we're looking for is active engagement. So some of the ways that we ourselves have tried to create this, of course, and I've highlighted 3 here, is very recently, some of our colleagues in Russia hosted the first installment of this year's BRICS International Youth Camp, which some of the colleagues here might be familiar with. We as Sabia have also hosted roundtables where we consulted with leaders, young leaders from across BRICS. We've gathered their viewpoints. It was not a webinar style event where speakers come and give their viewpoints. It was an opportunity for young people to engage among their peers. And then, of course, coming up in December, there's the International Youth BRICS Plus Forum, which, linking back to the topic of this discussion, is how BRICS and youth within BRICS are currently positioning themselves within the Global South phenomena. The question on engagement that I would like to highlight is, how can youth views in BRICS be engaged more authentically? And this is obviously a question I pose to stakeholders, but also to the governments of BRICS in our attempt to help them to realize the value of engaging youth. Briefly, one of the research attempts that we had during one of our engagements was that we asked participants and youth leaders who were engaging in our roundtable and I'll quickly read the question. We asked them, which challenges and problems from the list below do you believe need to be a top priority in the post-pandemic strategy for BRICS? As you can see, unemployment was at the top of the list, education second, mental health third, and access to healthcare was fourth, and then a range of other ones. The point that we're trying to raise here, because often when we engage those in decision-making positions, they tell us that youth issues are everyone's issues. So how is the youth unemployment different from other people's unemployment? But for us, it's a matter of prioritization, to know what is more important to young people, so that when we create policy, we can really be addressing the issues that they face and not the issues that the decision makers think they face. Lastly, and briefly, the issue of representation. So I've highlighted a few very prominent young leaders that many of you may recognize here. Obviously, the first one is the UN Envoy on Youth. The second one is the AU Envoy on Youth. The third one is actually a lady who is currently 22 and has become the youngest parliamentarian in Africa. She's currently a member of the Namibian Parliament. The fourth lady is obviously Malala, who we know, and the last one is Greta, who we also know. So the reason for highlighting these people is that we know them and they're very impactful people, and they've become leaders in the youth community at large. And they're also a manifestation of youth's engagement with multilateralism, to show that regardless of whether you're 22 or whether you're 25 or 26, you can engage the international system and you can actually engage the multilateral system. What we would warn against, however, is the issue of tokenism and superstardom. The idea that people then invite these individuals to their platforms and think that they have now represented youth. They have now brought youth to the table, when in reality, as we saw in the beginning, youth consists of 1.8 billion people around the world, and it is impossible for 5 people to represent that number of a constituency. So the question that we then have is, what formalized platforms exist in BRICS for youth representation? The BRICS Youth Summit, perhaps, but of course we know that is not consistent in the way that it's organized. It's not fully attended all the time. It doesn't receive the kind of support that it should. So these are the kind of questions that we as Sabia attempt to address. This is merely a brief representation of these 3 key engagements with youth that we've highlighted, and where different organizations are positioned within this universe, this international youth ecosystem. And we'd like to put this to decision makers within BRICS to ask them that they need to engage more authentically with this universe of youth activity if they hope to create a more sustainable approach to South-South cooperation. So a new multilateralism for a new generation, we envision as global citizenship with a global South perspective. We envision intergenerational co-leadership as the basis for youth engagement. We envision formalized and legitimized and accessible platforms for all youth to engage decision makers. And finally, a conceited attempt at exploring alternative forms of youth diplomacy and representation within the BRICS bloc. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rion van der Merwe. I'm really happy to have you here. One of the thoughts that you highlighted, and I really agree, are the pillars about how to engage more authentically the youth, the representation, and also education. So it was really important to have your presentation about prioritizing the BRICS youth agenda as a cornerstone of South-South cooperation. Thank you very much on behalf of Paulo Borba Gazella, the coordinator of the Center for BRICS Studies. So we will continue with our presentation in the 5th BRICS Conference of USP. We are discussing the cooperation and consensus in the rearrangement of global relations. And the panel that we are hosting today is the South-South Relations panel. Please don't miss the other unique and amazing panels that we're going to have during this week, including the energy and industrial revolution, the public opinion in BRICS, the women leadership in BRICS, the global health in BRICS, consulate representatives from China, South Africa, Russia, Brazil, and India will join us later on. We do also have a panel about minorities in BRICS countries, researching BRICS with the approaches, subjects, and institutions, the New Development Bank, intellectual property and juridics, is the special speech of Honorable the Ambassador of India in Brazil, and a discussion about environment and sustainability. So now I'm gonna give the floor to Professor and Dr. Evandro Carvalho, and a really good friend of mine. Really thank you for joining us today. I'm really flattered to have you here. Professor Dr. Evandro Carvalho is a professor of international law and head of the Center for Brazil-China Studies at Getúlio Vargas Foundation School of Law in Rio de Janeiro, the Direito Rio, direitorio.fgv.br, and associate professor of international law and member of the Center for BRICS Countries Studies at Fluminense Federal University School of Law in Brazil. He is also a PhD in international law at University of São Paulo. He is founding member of the Brazilian Network of Chinese Studies, the RB China. He is also a member of the permanent body of the FGV Chamber of Mediation and Arbitration, as well as legal consultant at Veirano Law Firm's China desk. Professor Dr. Evandro de Carvalho was a senior scholar at Shanghai University of Finance and Economics with the support of the Organization of American States and Chinese Scholarship Council program. And he was also a senior foreign expert at Center for BRICS Studies at Fudan University from 2014 until 2015. He was visiting professor at Shanghai University under the recruitment program of high-end foreign experts and visiting professor at the School of Government of the Beijing Normal University. In February 2015, he was one of the 60 foreign experts, including 2 economists awarded the Nobel Prize, which were invited to take part in the meeting of consultation of foreign experts with the Premier of China, Li Keqiang. In 2016, he took part in the program of Young Leaders from Latin America, a project launched by President Xi Jinping in 2015 during the forum China CELAC. And in 2018, he was selected to the visiting program for Young Sinologists led by the Chinese Ministry of Culture and Tourism and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and organized by the China International Cultural Communication Center and Beijing Language and Culture University. In 2019, he was one of the 14 foreign experts selected by Xinhua to have his life story with China told in the documentary Light of Wisdom, Belt and Road, which was broadcasted by CCTV Prime Time. In 2020, he was one of the winners of the Light of Civilization 2020, the Chinese Cultural Exchange Annual Figures and Institutions Award, organized by Guoshan Think Tank, China Cultural Exchange Network, One Belt, One Road Cultural Communication and Economic Development Task Force, and One Belt, One Road Professional Committee of China Business Story Society. He's the member of International Steering Committee of the Global Young Leaders Dialogue, initiated by the Center for China and Globalization and the Academy of Contemporary China and World Studies. Professor Dr. Evandro de Carvalho, welcome and join us. Welcome to join us. Really happy to have you here.
Thank you very much, my friend. When you asked me to send you a brief CV, I just, sent to you a file that I have, and then I'm a little bit, I was a little bit worried because you read everything. So sorry for that.
It would not
keep
be
the time of the
if
audience.
I haven't read the whole presentation and the awards.
Please, I didn't know that. So sorry. And good morning to all the audience, all the people that are watching us. Good morning, distinguished panelists. And I really enjoy and learn a lot from you. And it's an honor for me to participate in this 5th USP BRICS conference, which has become a reference in Brazil in studies on BRICS due to the tireless work of all who are part of the Center for BRICS Studies at USP, especially my friend, José Ricardo Luz Jr., and Professor Paulo Boba Casella. My special thanks to you for this opportunity. This session has as its theme South-South relations, as we know, and of course, I'd like to address this topic in the context of BRICS. I mean, how BRICS is giving its contribution to develop South-South cooperations, keeping its reformist spirit. BRICS is a platform for dialogue and cooperation that arises in the context of the, as we know, economic and financial crisis in 2008 that had the United States as its epicenter in this financial crisis. BRICS is also a response to the growing deficit of legitimacy and effectiveness of post-World War II international organizations in managing global challenges that affect, above all, emerging economies and developing countries. Without challenging the current international economic order, BRICS countries try to reform the international order. They aim to expand their participation in global decision-making process through great engagement in promoting the reform of the international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and also the United Nations. The agenda advocating the reform of international institutions to increase the participation of BRICS countries in international decision-making processes in a manner compatible with the relevance of their economies has become the main driver of the BRICS. This objective was already made clear in the first joint declaration of the BRIC leaders in Ekaterinburg, 2009, emphasized the commitment to advancing the reform of international financial institutions to give a louder voice and representation to emerging and developing economies. At that time, they made factual claims to promote these reforms by declaring that the emerging and developing economies must have greater voice and representation in international financial institutions whose heads and executives should be appointed through an open, transparent, and merit-based selection process. The following declaration from the second summit held in Brasilia reinforces this position by explaining that the IMF and the World Bank urgently need to resolve their legitimacy deficits through a substantial shift in voting power in favor of emerging economies, markets, and developing countries. BRICS declarations will mention several times the central role of the G20 due to its representativeness and economic weight in the management of the global economy. Since the first summit in 2009, they highlight the central role played by the G20 summits in dealing with the financial crisis. The reformist agenda also reaches the United Nations. All 5 countries state the need for comprehensive reform of the United Nations to make it more efficient so that it can deal with the current global challenges more effectively. BRICS have highlighted in its actions in 2 big areas, if we can say this. The first is in the economic and financial governance, with priority to coordination within the G20 and the reform of the IMF and the World Bank, etc. Second is in the sphere of political governance with the reform of the United Nations. The initial skepticism with which some Western countries observed this group in its first years of existence was questioned when the BRICS created its first international organization. It is the New Development Bank. BRICS is not an international organization. It does not have a legal personality, nor is it endowed with a permanent institutional structure in charge of preparing the summits. The summits are the responsibility of the country holding the presidency of the group each year. Despite the lack of an institutional structure with a permanent secretariat, this informal platform allowed the 5 countries to identify common needs and consider the possibility of institutionalizing specific strategic initiatives. For example, at the 4th summit in New Delhi in 2012, BRICS did not hide their dissatisfaction with the slow pace of quota reforms and IMF governance, and that the World Bank is an institution that does not reflect its members' vision. At this summit, BRICS expressed for the first time the possibility of establishing a new developed bank aimed at mobilizing resources for infrastructure and sustainable development projects in BRICS countries and other emerging economies and developing countries. In 2014, at the 6th Summit of the BRICS, held in Brazil, the 5 countries signed the agreement establishing the new developed bank. On July 3rd, 2015, the agreement entered into force. The headquarters of NDB is in Shanghai, and the first regional office, Africa Regional Center, was established in Johannesburg, South Africa in 2017. In 2019, NDB opened the regional office of the Americas in São Paulo. As established in Article 2 of the NDB agreement, the purpose of the bank is to mobilize resources for projects in BRICS and other emerging market economies and developing countries. Therefore, the financing of infrastructure projects in developing countries is excluded, in developed countries is excluded. This rule is an essential aspect of the bank's characteristics. However, according to the agreement on the NDB Article 5, the membership shall be open to members of the United Nations at such time as under such terms and conditions as the bank shall determine by a special majority at the Board of Governors. NDB is therefore open for the admission of new members, whether developed or developing countries. However, the agreement sets forth some limitations on voting power. To developed countries, voting power cannot exceed 20%. In addition, the BRICS countries, founders of the NDB, maintain the prerogative of being together the bank's largest shareholders. These limitations to developed countries can be seen as a guarantee that the NDB will not detach itself from the guidelines that guided the political action of BRICS in promoting the economy of emerging markets and developing countries. The first decade of BRICS ends in an international context different from that one of the initial years. During its first years, BRICS countries maintained high growth rates and enjoyed greater political and social stability. Today, more than 10 years after its first summit, BRICS faces a diverse context at the domestic level and adverse scenarios at the international level. There are some risks due to the current trend of expansion of international protectionism and unilateralism. The unilateralist foreign policy of the United States under Donald Trump before was a rupture with the commitment of the United States to multilateralism and international organizations. Biden's government indeed contrasts with its predecessor, but US tensions with Russia and the trade and technology war against China remain and intensify, bringing even more uncertainty about the future of the international order. In this context, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi announced in March 2017 the Chinese government's proposal to redefine the contours of the BRICS to include other major developing economies. This proposal was known as BRICS Plus. It reaffirmed the commitment to strengthening cooperation with emerging markets and developing countries. The declaration of the 19th BRICS Summit in Xiamen mentioned the BRICS Plus proposal. Some favorable aspects can be pointed out. The BRICS Plus may have the effect of diluting the relatively high weight of the Chinese and Indian economy within the group. And the expansion of BRICS members is in tune, despite its focus on South-South cooperation with outreach dialogues. These outreach dialogues concern the participation of, is related to the participation of third states in the BRICS summits. The objective of the outreach dialogue is to publicize the BRICS and increase engagement and cooperation with other countries that are not members of the group, notably emerging and developing economies and relevant international and regional organizations. In 2013, during the fifth summit held in Durban, the leaders of the BRICS countries met with leaders of countries on the African continent. At the fourth summit in Fortaleza, the governments of the BRICS countries held a joint session with the leaders of the South American nations, members of UNASUR. The seventh summit on the BRICS in Ufa, Russia, was held together with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, whose members, in addition to Russia and China, were Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and at this meeting, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization established the membership procedures for India and Pakistan, which were accepted as members of the organization 2 years later. At the eighth summit of the BRICS in Goa, India, the leaders of the 5 countries met with their counterparts from the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, which involves, in addition to India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. At the 9th summit in Xiamen, the Chinese government invited Egypt, Guinea, Mexico, Tajikistan, and Thailand, and so on. These outreach dialogues are led by the country hosting the summit. There are no indications that the other BRICS countries participate in choosing non-BRICS countries to invite. In other words, the outreach dialogues are still restricted to the priority interests of the country hosting the summit and not to the interests of the group of BRICS countries based on a joint assessment of this dialogue. Finally, it is legitimate to ask whether the BRICS Plus and the outreach dialogues reinforce the agenda in defense of the reform of international institutions and the goals of the BRICS countries. Concerning BRICS Plus, it is a question of assessing whether it would be a platform restricted to economic cooperation. And about the outreach dialogue, it is asking whether they have been limited to serving only the regional interests of the countries hosting the summit. BRICS tend to expand its members, NDB as well. In the case of NDB, it will have 3 new members. They are the United Arab Emirates, Uruguay, and Bangladesh. But there is a difference between BRICS and NDB on this matter. BRICS necessarily cover the political governance agenda, while NDB is restricted to the sphere of economic financial governments within limits established by its articles of agreement. BRICS Plus is open for the membership of countries that fall under the scope of the South-South cooperation. At the same time, NDB is also open for the membership of developed countries, but these developed countries join the bank with a different status vis-à-vis the founding members concerning voting power. BRICS is in process of transformation. When post-World War II international organizations suffer from institutional paralysis and a growing lack of legitimacy, proposals to expand dialogue and promote cooperation such as the BRICS are welcome as they collaborate to build an international order more inclusive. But there are challenges within BRICS itself to be faced, such as intra-BRICS trade, where China still has a significant preponderance in bilateral trade with each of the BRICS countries. Cooperation in the health sector is another area where BRICS countries could do better to face the pandemic, for example. And above all, the emphasis is on initiatives to promote economic development, especially those dedicated to fighting against extreme poverty, where China has had significant success, and achieving the targets established at the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. There are so many opportunities given the possibilities created by new technologies and new infrastructure. In this regard, the various fora that happened during the months before the summit itself are very welcome. In the second decade of the existence of BRICS, domestic and international challenges are even more significant. Multilateralism and democratization of the international system must always be the main objective of BRICS. This is the reason why the BRICS was created. Initiatives like BRICS Plus, outreach dialogues, and the several BRICS meetings that happen side by side the summit, like BRICS Youth Forum, BRICS Business Forum, BRICS Women Forum, BRICS Legal Forum, etc., contribute to this objective, and also the reformist agenda. And this is a fundamental condition for the development of South-South cooperation. So these are my thoughts that I would like to share with you all. And again, thank you very much, José Ricardo, for this kind invitation to participate in this very important conference. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Evandro Carvalho, for your valuable insights and a unique presentation, highlighting the importance about the BRICS and emphasizing that the BRICS have challenges and also common needs. And we do need to address the specific strategic activities, especially for the sustainable development and technology, among other relevant topics. Thank you very much. We are live on YouTube in the first session that is about the South-South relations in the 5th BRICS conference of USP with the theme this year of cooperation and consensus in the arrangement of global relations. On behalf of Professor Dr. Paulo Borba Casella, the coordinator of the Center for BRICS Studies, I would like to thank all the special guests and panelists who joined us during this first panel. And don't miss the audience, please don't miss the other several interesting topics that we're gonna discuss during this conference. The next one would be headed by the moderator, Dr. José Nantala, who is also a colleague, a friend, and a researcher of the Center for BRICS Studies, the GBRICS. And the next panel will be about energy and industrial revolution, the current state of affairs related to energy issues and advancements in industrial revolution. So for those who would like to address some questions, please, you may feel free to leave it in the YouTube comments, and we're gonna later on provide proper reply and feedback for you. Thank you all for joining us in this first panel about South-South relations. Just wait for a few minutes, in a couple of minutes, we're gonna start the second panel. Thanks a lot for everyone in China, in India, in Russia, in Brazil, and I declare very happy and honored the end of the first session. Bye-bye. Secretário, muitíssimo obrigado, viu?